Thank you, Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, dear friends and colleagues and brothers in Christ. The second rule of the Quinisext Council, and there I'd like to correct, it is the authentic and distorted in canonic tradition. The second canon of that Quinisext Council is the first example whereby there's an official settlement of the original and authentic source of canonic law, of the law that has been applied in the indivisible church, in our Orthodox Church of the East, and the very first effort to codify the canons that have been accepted and adopted since the beginning of times. By this very succinct phrase, Bishop Paul refers to the ad hoc of the second canon of the Quinisext that consolidated the content of the corpus of the canons that was complemented by the rules of canons of the Seventh Council, the First, the Second, and the Saint Sophia Council. Within the context of my presentation, we will be focusing on how these specific corpus of canons has been developed after the second century. This is a constant problem of mine. The limited time allowed does not allow but for some facets to be highlighted of this multifaceted problem, as they are being highlighted through the study of manuscripts that may provide us with a primary and nevertheless very clear picture of the whole issue. Let me start with sources of the 11th century by making a leap after the 9th century, a time as of which the discussions on this issue have started gradually to become more diffuse, and I'm referring to Int.Conf of the Black Mountain, who, as a response to a question put through to him by a monk, namely Lucas, on the paternity of Canonicus the fasting, says the following: I have researched the sources of manuscripts I have in my hands and determined that some manuscripts suggest and now the speaker is quoting ancient Greek.
Διακόνου μαθητού του Αγίου Βασιλείου, ούτινος η επωνυμία τέκνων της υπακοής.
In other manuscripts, there is the character, and again the speaker is quoting ancient Greek.
Αυτά πάντα γράφωση και ούτως ποιη έως σούσε στην τείχο αποστόματος. Και πάλιν έχει στην απρολόγους 2, τους δύο προλόγους.
And in two prologues, also quoted by this holy intellectual, again the speaker is quoting ancient Greek. Thus, the conclusion drawn is that out of many suggestions, it is demonstrated that without naming what the other things are, and without even suggesting any further investigation be made for a more clear determination of the paternity of this piece of work, Int.Conf was not distinguished for some deep intellect, such as to provide me the possibility to be more specific and more perceptive as of such an investigation, nor were the sources in that helpful. This paternity is being recorded in posterior manuscript tradition of the work, as of which there is an effort of sorts waged to resolve this theological issue. Indicatively, in the Code of Iberians of the 14th century, subsequent to the title by the Patriarch of Constantinople, John the Fasting, on the confessions and differences, there is an explanatory footnote according to which, ancient Greek,
αλλά Ιωάννου μαθητού
footnote suggesting that this is an idea by Ioannis, a deacon and a disciple of Saint Basil and a pupil of his. Thus, the author of this footnote chooses to attribute this piece of work to John, who is supposedly a pupil of St. Basil. Very frequently in manuscript tradition, these two persons identify, and without going into details as to the recording of the manuscripts, out of the 6 I am quoting from the 13th through to the 16th century, I would like to stress the Sina 482 manuscript that has a very high theological and literary interest, also dealt by Professor Troianos, titled By Our Father Ioannis, the Fasting Pupil of St. Basil, etc., etc. All too frequently, all these two pieces of work are juxtaposed, and both for the attribution of authorship and elsewhere, there is a first theory for the interdependence of these two works that was erroneously invoked, both for the interpretation of the Byzantine liturgies and for other reasons. It is known that many believe that John the Chrysostomus was copying things from St. Basil. And another reference, ancient Greek,
Πρόεδρος, ο Εναγής Ιωάννης, από του προαυτού τα όμοια κανονίσαντος Ιωάννου, μαθητού γενομένου του Μεγάλου Βασιλείου, τα σαφορμάς έγραψεν, εκείνος από του οικείου διδασκάλου. Για τον Νίκονο,
as far as Nikon is concerned, the exclusion of John the Fasting as an author is further corroborated by the fact that his life has been silent as to any authorship, especially when it comes to canons and laws. And besides, as of his life, there has been no reference to the relationship of such authorship as the person could have been attributed to through disciples and his manuscripts. The life, a quotation in ancient Greek,
ούτε σύγγραμμα ιονδήποτε πόποτε έγραψεν, μάλλον δε νομοκάνονον, είτε όλος περί μαθητών εξαγορεύσεις ιονδήποτε φέρει, ούτε καν επιστολή εις ιονδήποτε μαθητήν, καθώς εις τα διάφτα νομοκάνονα λέγει ότι πλήθη και γυναικών είχε εις μαθητείαν. Το ισχυρότερο...
The most strong argument by Nikon was that this canonic text was ignored by the second canon of the 26th Council, comprising, amongst others, some canonic texts by patriarchs of Constantinople and other fathers, referring to lesser assumptions of canonic nature. And Nikon does refer himself to the case of the letter by Athanasius the Great to Amu, a monk, you know the content of that letter. To corroborate that position, Nikon quotes a part of the canon by the 26th, imposing the interdiction of any falsification or transgression of rules, or of false rules, rules that try to undermine the truth. In reality, according to Nikon, the canon fortified the Church and truly consolidated the stability of the relationship between the genuine and the false canons. Then Nikon corroborates his position by justifying it by way of reference to various arguments, 9-0, further invoking quotation in ancient Greek. We're sorry about that. Amongst which Nikon scorned all those who disregarded the canons of the Church. Nikon is further invoking that that specific council, quotation in ancient Greek,
χρόνων των θείων πατέρων συνόδων και του Μεγάλου Βασιλείου εξικολούθησεν, ότι περί πορνικών αιτιών η υπόθεση είναι.
He quoted as an example the canons applying in the case of prostitution and what kind of penitence should be imposed upon persons who are practicing these. As of that same time, under the patriarchate of Nicholas III Grammaticus, there was submitted to the Patriarchal Council of Constantinople a series of questions, amongst which one about whether it should be accepted according to the canonical of the fasting certain activities, and there was a letter by the council sent. And it is interesting quoted because there is a version of the text that is more clear than the one given in the digest of responses commented by Valsamon. Quotation in ancient Greek.
Τούτου κανονίζεστε τους πολλούς, διό και πολλούς θεσμούς της Εκκλησίας η βίβλος αυτή ανέτρεψεν και προς το αμαρτάνιν ανεσχυντοτέρως πεποίηκεν δια την άλογος συγκατάθεσιν, δια τούτο η εν γνώση του καλού όντες και σφαλόμενοι δια της κανονικής επανορθωθήσονται βίβλου. Στην απόκριση...
In that response, there is no further reference to what the appropriate Bible is, but we may assume that by that reference we mean the canons in the formal corpus, amongst which that of Basil the Great. In that same text, there is acknowledged the widespread use of the canonical texts, although, according to the Council, reversed some ecclesiastical standards and sometimes became a controversial issue. That similar view, whatever ambivalences, is adopted by Nikiforos Hartophilakas, who, in a response to a monk Theodosius from Corinth, underscores the authority of the canons in the preamble of the 26th, preamble or proemion with respect to the second, and obviously the first canon is also found in our manuscript tradition. Therefore, if these canons are taken out, the 26th has established 100 canons, which is a comprehensive set of canons. Nevertheless, it still accepts, Hartophilakas accepts the usage according to which there is a possibility to impose penitences according to Ioannis the fasting. Quotation in ancient Greek. So there is a conformity to whatever the canons establish on the part of the formal, the official ecclesiastical bodies. Given these specificities, we could even scorn Nikon, because although he knew that the work by the faster is false, never confirmed by the 26th Council, and that the Council of the Union blatantly ignore it, he himself, in a large number of works, tends to use and reuse it, and sometimes even quoting and praising it by saying, quotation in ancient Greek,
Πατέρων, εν τη βίβλο του νηστευτού ευρίσκονται και κανονισμένα επιτιμήσεις των διαφόρων αμαρτημάτων. Η επίκληση του κανονισμού.
The invocation of the canonic by Nikon happens many times in order to justify certain practices and views, mostly because he himself and the diffuse ambience of the time are there, sometimes invoked to consolidate these views. The fasting said he would much rather be scorned as tolerant by the Lord than praised as a sympathizer. This principle that the faster considered to be of interest for him and the Church is what solidified the position, although the council under Nicholas Grammaticus doubted it, and because, despite the fact that the works by the faster, as Nikon himself acknowledges, when it comes to fasting, are not always conformant to the holy canons. Similarly, Nikon acknowledges that the canonical rules governing the operation of the great monasteries of the Holy Mountain, Athos, and Jerusalem are not always conformant when it comes to fasting to the holy canons. By that, indirect but clearly accepting the relationship of the monastic rules with the rules of Ioannis the Faster. Nikon was convinced that that work was the work of a monk. Such kind of discord between the typical rules and the canons is also determined by Valsamon, who, contrary to Patriarch Nikolaos, has different stance. The dialect relationship between the original, the authentic and the distorted, what exists in the corpus of the canons and what was posteriorly introduced by the institutional organs of the Church, and sometimes even upon private initiative, and further witnessed and projected in various canonic sources of the 10th and 11th century, was maintained and preserved in canonic tradition with a tendency to consolidate, whether tacitly and without opposition, to the detriment of the formal corpus of the canons. The typical rules of Ioannis the Faster is contained in collections of manuscripts side by side with the scorns by Nikon. Many collections, many digests witness upon the amplitude of acceptance of the text of that tradition that are attributed to presumed authors, mostly the Patriarch Ioannis the Fasting and Nikiforos Homologitis, although that was not controlled. The false, distorted, and even false, the more time gets closer to the Ottoman rule becomes prevalent. Such phenomenon was further favored by the various digesta, which by definition and ex structura failed to reflect the corpus of the canons. Let me invoke only two examples to highlight my position. As of a digest of 13 manuscripts of canons in Arabic, and in that I'm also covering other churches in other languages maintained today in the Patriarchate of Antioch, extending from 1934 through to the 19th century. There are some fragmented exposures of the canons, both authentic and distorted ones, some 80 and 107 canons attributed to the First Council and to Epiphanius, Patriarch of Constantinople or Constantia. Most of those manuscripts are like this. There are only two authentic canons replicating the corpus Ieros Nomos, sacred law, on the initiative of Patriarch Sylvester. And in those manuscripts of the Patriarchate of Antioch, the presence of the canons by the Faster is existent but limited. The Faster also was becoming known in Slavonic languages, although as the text of 1606 and ever since there have been many re-editions and reprints of that version, was a text that relied on Greek texts, as of which the text by the Faster coexisted with the Euchologian. Manuscript Lavras Theta 91 with the 16th century is an example of that. In a code of that same library dating from the 1600s by Ginos of Pogonia, the phenomenon of the distorted and the authentic is more than apparent. Here the Faster is acknowledged as the more productive of all canon producers of the Church. In studying the several collections, digest of canons produced during the Ottoman rule, and by that I would like also to say, with your permission, that amongst the bestsellers of that time, the Digest of Canons was one. It is confirmed how right were the authors of Pidalion when in the preamble they suggested that we could not tolerate, dear brothers, to see amongst the various vulgar texts the fragmentation of these holy canons, distorted, altered, and distancing themselves from the right interpretation, misinterpreted, and teachings that have no substance. Nico nevertheless shared the opinion formulated by contemporary monks from Mount Athos and elsewhere, for the improvement of these digest, and so he undertook the responsibility of bringing back the genuine. Going back to the primal sources as a point of departure of his research led to the completion of the effort, thanks to the capacity and the possibility to critically approach sources, manuscripts, and texts. Nicodemus was a well-educated person, quite audacious. Not by accident was he open to the criticism by the Patriarchate of Constantinople, protagonized by Dorothos Volismas. In various controversial issues that relied on principles that were widely accepted by the ecclesiastic circle at the time, as is the ordainment of the heretics. Similar criticism was voiced against Chrysostomos Prodromitis for whatever ascetic notions there were in his works, and all these were even criticized and censured, because both such authors suggested that the heretic clergymen that came back to the church should not be reordained, because this is also corroborated and sustained in the minutes of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Here, Nicodemus, Christopher, and other monks of Mount Athos of the time shared this tradition. They were part of it, they endorsed it, and that I would say that the modern literature indeed indulges itself into a perverse distortion. In Pedalion, there is a use of canonic sources, and contrary to the majority of the authors and the copiers of the precepts of the time, it tried to highlight the distorted and control the falsity of these texts by selecting amongst the rules of the Faster and Nikephoros Homologitis, where in those sources found inspiration, in order to put these canons within the context of the corpus. In this way, Nicodemus rejected many rules and canons by the Faster, by averting the consolidation of the codexes of the time. More or less, Nicodemus imitated the act by Mattheus Vlastaris, which by the synopsis of the canon digest by Nisteftis, by the Faster, came up with a new set of canons that were attributed to the Faster, and which started to change to the stricter by a stricter implementation for the penitents, just as it is confessed and underscored by Vlastaris. Such mutation is also noted by another person, Isaac from the Meteoros, and Nicodemus of Mount Athos, much later in time. I may even conclude my presentation here. The only thing I would like to add, respecting the time allowed to me, that I have many more examples from the Manichaean tradition to invoke, whereby it becomes evident to what degree this corpus of canons was further complemented by other texts, although that complementation was not free of consequences on the canonic spirit of the Church. And a very typical example of what I'm saying is the one where it is suggested, and this is why the letter by Hartophilacus was written to the attention of Theodosius the monk, the hermit, the issue of confession by a sacrilegious monk. There is a series of texts that have been recorded in these collections where there is a different kind of ecclesiology, whether we like it or not. What really pays to retain is that in the course of the life of the Church, such traditions have been recorded and even judged. Another issue that the sources inspire us to discuss is the incursion of monachism, is the issue of the haircut after the ordainment. If a bishop becomes a monk, may no longer maintain its position because there is a change of status, and ecclesiologically everything is fine. But from that point on, in the tradition of the Church, If we attribute false canons to the Fourth Council, where it is said that this rule applies also for the elder and for the deacons and for the priests, this canon was maintained only to operate as a ipso jure sanction or a tacit deordainment in order to avoid the scorning to the detriment of the monks and the priests. The fact remains that in the second millennium, in the well-known corpus of canons, there are other canonic texts added, so we may safely say that in the course of time, all these texts come to complete the original corpus, corroborated by the 26th Council, and continues to be corroborated by each and every canonic act by the Church. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ευχαριστώντας τον κύριο.
Thank you.